Hi everyone, we're back with another show on the Health Manifesto podcast. Each week we explore the latest health-related science and technology, and more importantly, how to apply it to your everyday life. We're here to bring clarity, not confusion. And today's topic? Like always, it'll hit home for almost everyone. Welcome to the final episode of Season 1, an in-depth dive into each chapter of the book, the Health Manifesto. The podcast will continue with weekly interviews, but more on that at the end. If you've been with us from the start, you know this journey hasn't been about offering answers. It's been about asking better questions, slower questions, questions that bring you back to the body instead of pulling you away from it. And as we wrap this series, we want to take a moment to reflect, not just on the episodes, but on the chapters that inspired them. Because each episode was rooted in a chapter of the book, not as a script, but as a foundation, a starting point, a moment of friction that needed to be explored out loud, with breath and space and silence in between. Episode 1 was born from the opening chapter of the book, the moment we name the rupture, that internal fracture where things no longer feel okay, even though they might look okay from the outside. This wasn't just about burnout. It was about that quiet, disorienting realization that the system you've been following, the one that promised health if you followed the rules, was never actually designed with your body in mind. The book opens with that moment because every transformation begins with disillusionment, and the podcast echoed that tone. It wasn't loud, it wasn't reactive, it was steady, grounded. Because real rebellion doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it begins with the simplest sentence. Something feels off. That's what Episode 1 held space for. It gave voice to the thing people feel in their gut before they ever find the words. It mirrored that quiet frustration, that quiet clarity, the early stages of waking up. And instead of rushing past that moment, the book and the podcast stayed with it. Let it speak. Because until we name what's broken, we can't imagine what's possible. Episode 2 brought us into the subtle collapse, a concept introduced in Chapter 2. The book describes how burnout doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's numbness. Sometimes it's a constant hum of anxiety. Sometimes it's going through the motions, looking fine on paper but feeling flat inside. The podcast mirrored that energy. It didn't aim to diagnose, it aimed to name, to reflect how overstimulation, overexposure, and overcommitting have become the new baseline, and how easy it is to miss the signs until your body begins to shut down. We talked about how numbness can be misread as resilience, how always being on is often mistaken for strength, and how true calm doesn't come from withdrawing from life, but from learning how to participate in it without dissolving inside it. It was a quiet inventory, a call to begin noticing again, not in crisis, but in curiosity. Episode 3 introduced the idea of the underground rebellion, as explored in Chapter 3. The book describes how real health conversations often live in the margins, in the spaces that aren't broadcast, in the stories that aren't trending. It's a rebellion not of resistance, but of remembering, of asking, what if the system isn't broken, but built this way on purpose? What if the real wisdom lives in the people who have been dismissed for speaking up? The podcast episode reflected that quietly subversive energy. It made space for the discomfort of questioning mainstream health narratives. It invited listeners to examine what they've internalized and what they've been too tired or too polite to challenge. We talked about how real transformation often happens when no one's watching, that the real experts might not be on stage, and that sometimes healing begins not with volume, but with depth. Episode 4 took us into the performance, what we called health theater, explored in Chapter 4. This chapter unpacked how so much of what passes for healthcare is actually a performance. Checklists, rushed consultations, surface-level protocols that do little to support actual healing. The podcast brought that chapter to life by pulling back the curtain. We explored the illusion of care, how systems are often designed to manage people, not truly see them. And we asked what happens to the body when it keeps getting reduced to a set of symptoms to be managed, rather than a story to be understood. We talked about how modern care often prioritizes liability over listening, productivity over presence, and how that system trains not just providers, but patients to override their needs, to normalize being unheard. This episode asked, what if healing isn't about better performance inside the system, but about naming the system itself and stepping outside it? Because naming the illusion is the first step to dismantling it, and how naming the illusion is the first step to dismantling it. Episode 5 marked a shift, the reintroduction of agency rooted in Chapter 5. The book called this the sovereign body. Not in the sense of isolation or rugged independence, but in the sense of coming home to your own authority. The podcast extended this idea by asking, what would it mean to live like your body belongs to you again? Not in theory, but in daily choices, in boundaries, in rhythm. We talked about how sovereignty isn't about going it alone. It's about being the one who gets to decide how you move, how you eat, how you rest, without asking for permission from systems that were never built to include you. It was an invitation to stop outsourcing your instincts, to stop waiting for someone else to validate your symptoms, your hunger, your timing, and to remember that your body doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be respected. Because agency isn't force, it's presence. And reclaiming that presence is where healing begins. Episode 6 explored blame and the weaponization of personal responsibility, as detailed in Chapter 6. The book lays out how institutions and programs have learned to disguise systemic failure as personal choice. It's not that people don't care about their health. It's that they're told it's their fault when the system doesn't work for them. The podcast carried that forward by unpacking the emotional toll of self-blame. We talked about how phrases like, "you just need more discipline," or "you must not want it badly enough," become internalized, and how shame often gets mistaken for motivation. We asked what it would look like to replace that shame spiral with self-respect, to treat responsibility not as pressure to perform, but as relationship, a willingness to show up for your body consistently, even when the outcome isn't clear. This episode was about untangling guilt from guidance and finding a way to return to your body without punishment. Episode 7 questioned optimization, the myth that the body is a machine to be measured, tracked, and upgraded. In Chapter 7, we unpacked how health has been reduced to metrics, step counts, sleep scores, glucose spikes, recovery bands. The podcast leaned into the subtle pressure of this mindset. We explored how data, when used in excess, can disconnect us from the very signals it claims to enhance. How living by numbers can override lived experience. How tracking fatigue can become more exhausting than the fatigue itself. We offered a counterpoint, not anti-data, but pro-discernment. A rhythm-based approach. One where numbers inform, but don't control. Where the body's signals, hunger, fullness, rest, tension, are honored, not overridden. Because healing isn't found in the dashboard, it's found in relationship, and no device can interpret that for you, of knowing, of choosing what actually feels good. Episode 8, Deconstructed Balance, the myth that wellness means holding everything in equal measure at all times. Chapter 8 challenged the glorified idea of symmetry and proposed a more sustainable alternative. Rhythm, tilt, timing. The podcast gave voice to that shift by inviting people to stop striving for perfection and start living in alignment with what matters now. We talked about how real health isn't about juggling all things at once. It's about knowing what to lean into, what to pause, and when to come back. We questioned the culture of burnout hidden inside polished balance routines, and we offered something simpler in return: rhythm that adapts, tilt that's honest, rest that's earned not through exhaustion, but through listening. This episode reminded us that not everything has to be held all the time. Some things can wait, some things should wait. And when we stop chasing balance and start practicing rhythm, the body finally has space to recalibrate. Episode 9 dropped us into the gut, not just as a digestive system, but as a core of intuition and regulation. Chapter 9 explored what happens when we replace relationship with information. It described how health culture has become dominated by protocols, testing, and gut health plans. So much so that we stop listening to our own signals. The podcast gave space to the overwhelm that comes from trying to do everything right, but still feeling bloated, reactive, and unwell. We explored how the gut responds not just to food, but to rhythm, breath, and nervous system state. We questioned what it means to truly nourish ourselves, and we asked, what if healing your gut starts with slowing down enough to hear it again? What if the best protocols are the ones that restore consistency and calm, not just eliminate foods? This episode reminded us that regulation doesn't come from outside, it begins inside. In the moment you start partnering with your body instead of micromanaging it. Episode 10 pulled it all into the nervous system, the part of the body that holds the pattern beneath every pattern. Chapter 10 reframed calm not as a goal, but as a state, a nervous system baseline that many of us have lost through years of chronic stress, performance culture, and emotional override. The podcast carried that message forward by naming calm as access, something biological, not aspirational. We explored how regulation isn't a mindset, it's a practice, one built through rhythm, repetition, and small daily cues of safety. We offered practical ways to stop performing wellness and start creating the conditions that restore it, through breath, through timing, through learning how to downshift the body without abandoning the momentum of your life. Because calm isn't a luxury, it's your baseline. And when you rebuild it, everything else begins to recalibrate. Episode 11 brought us to the moment the body speaks, and no one listens. Chapter 11 looked at symptoms not as disruptions, but as the body's attempt to communicate, as stories encoded in tension, fatigue, pain, and flare-ups. The podcast slowed everything down. We explored what it means to stop managing symptoms and start listening to them. We invited listeners to recognize patterns instead of dismiss them, to notice the difference between discomfort that signals growth and pain that warns of boundary breaches. We asked what it would look like to build a relationship with the body where the signals don't have to escalate just to get heard, where softness is strength, where regulation is not a reward, but a rhythm. This episode reminded us that healing doesn't come from silencing the body. It comes from learning how to stay when it speaks. This is the arc of the book. And it's also the arc of a body coming back online, from noise to clarity, from performance to presence, from theory to practice. In our next episode, everything will shift. We'll be joined by our co-host, and instead of solo reflections, we'll be answering your most asked questions. The ones you've messaged, emailed, and whispered to yourself when no one was looking. We're not here to gloss over it. We're here to go deeper, to name what's hard, unpack it, and meet it with clarity, without pretending it's simple, but without getting lost in it either. This is where the rebellion becomes real. Until then, download the full audiobook and ebook of The Health Manifesto at manifesto.health. And keep returning to the pages, the episodes, and most of all, your own rhythm. We'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to The Health Manifesto. This show is about one thing, helping you understand the systems around you so you can take smarter, simpler steps toward your own well-being. We'll see you next time.